Hi, my name is Jordan Stevens. I will be co-presenting with Jed Reese and Katie Scheme. We teach sixth grade at Plain City Elementary. We want to welcome you to our presentation, which is titled Principles and Tools for Building Student Success. We hope that this presentation will give you some ideas that you can apply into your classroom so that your students can be more successful. We feel that all teachers should have a goal that no matter what subject they're teaching, that they should be leading building student success. They should be trying to get students to be successful. And as we go through the PLC process, from the design of not only instruction, but the assessments, from lesson planning to interventions to feedback, everything should build towards creating student success. The other reason why we chose the word build is it puts the responsibility in the teacher's hands, that students can be successful if we build a pathway for them to be successful. In order to do that, in our presentation, we're going to be talking about 3 principles and how we can apply those principles in our classroom so that students can be successful. The first principle is clarity. The second principle is collective student efficacy. And the third principle is high student motivation. We know the research says if we have these 3, along with many others, but these are the only 3 we're going to be focusing on, that the students have a high likelihood of being successful. Now the question is, how do we have clarity in the classroom, collective student efficacy, and high student motivation? And that's where the tools come in play. So this image shows that in our world, we have a knowledge doing gap. We know that we can search up any topic and find endless amounts of information, from books to articles to scientific studies. So we know what makes successful classrooms. The problem is the doing, the applying makes it really tricky. So what happens is we have this knowledge doing gap. Now, what a tool does is, a tool, just like this ladder, it's going to help bridge that gap. So the tool is how we apply what we know into the classroom, and hopefully that will close our knowledge doing gap.
Hey, it's Jed Reese here. I want to talk to you about the first principle, which is clarity. Now, I've come up with 3 tools that are working well for me in my classroom. Um, as we make this presentation, we know that a lot of you are seasoned teachers and you have really good experience in the class. You know what you're doing. For those of you that are well experienced, this is going to be kind of a review. But we also understand that there are new teachers out there. So it is a little bit tricky to find middle ground. So if you are a seasoned teacher, this might be kind of a checklist for you to go through and just reevaluate if you're doing these things. Maybe you'll catch something that you maybe need to work on. If you're a new teacher, this is a good checklist for you. Make sure that you put these things in your back pocket and that you're implementing all these tools to help have clarity for yourself and clarity for your students. So the first tool that I wanted to talk to you about, which textbook are you using? For us teachers who've been around for a little while, we were really used to looking at a book like this. And I feel like, a lot of the times as we're flipping through pages, that's right in front of us. It's really easy to get um, familiar with this textbook. But the problem was it wasn't up to the core standards. We were teaching a lot of things that were not even in the core. I think maybe if you remember the old red textbook, my first year teaching sixth grade, I stressed so much about teaching the surface area of cylinders, which is nowhere to be found in the core. So we need to shift our attention from the textbook mentality to this being our textbook, which is the core standards. So I'd like to invite you, seasoned teachers, to just go through and make sure that you're flipping through the core like you did in chapters of an old textbook. Make sure that you're reviewing things and just taking some time every once in a while to go back and reevaluate your teaching, making sure that you're hitting the things that are actually in the core. 2 things happen then. You get some serious clarity and you take things off your plate. You end up finding that you're teaching a little bit less, which is a really, really nice feeling in a world where things are just constantly dumped on us. We have so much on our plates. If you go through the core, you take something off of it. For the newer teachers, this is your job. Your job is literally laid out uh, in the core. So, are you an expert yet? That's the best thing that's worked for me is just going through and taking a look at this core, making sure that I know exactly what I'm supposed to be teaching. It's a really good feeling. So, once you become an expert, in my first couple of years teaching sixth grade, it was like I know exactly what I'm supposed to be teaching, but I don't know how much I'm supposed to be teaching. Maybe you've seen this before. This is the layout of the important things in our core. So if you notice, ratios and proportional relationships represents 28 to 32%. That is a big rock. Expressions and equations, we can also include inequalities in that. 28 to 34%. Those two chapters are huge. So one thing that we've tried to do as teacher fellows, I know in approach one, we've tried to reflect these percentages. We've tried to have about 32% of the lessons be on ratios and proportional relationships. And we've tried to have about 34% of the lessons be on expressions and equations. One thing that I wanted to share with you 2 years ago, at the end of the year when we're reviewing, I talked to my class, what do you want to review? And about half the hands shot up and everybody was super worried about geometry. And that to me was kind of a fail, because if geometry represents split with statistics and probability represents only about 16%, my students were way more worried about that than I was. So I think it's really important for teachers to know this. And on the student side, not surprised, I think it's really important for students to know this as well. So one thing that's worked really well for me is I show this to my students periodically. They know what to expect. This year with geometry, yeah, it's important to be stressed about it, but I hope they're way more positively stressed about expressions and equations, because that is the most important thing that we teach in sixth grade. So, new teachers, make sure that you know these percentages, and seasoned teachers, do your students know these percentages? That's going to be something that really helps them as well. And in the rare case that you've got a student who's really motivated, if they're going to go home and practice some expressions and equations and equalities, ratios and proportional relationships, that's going to really, really benefit you. Okay, so teacher and student clarity comes from the core and knowing the breakdown of that core. The next tool may be really obvious, but it is just straight up good teaching. So I recently had a level 2 student in my class doing her practicum, and she sent me an email and she wanted to know what are some principles for good teaching. And I found myself thinking about that a lot before I responded to her. So I've kind of compiled a list. Again, seasoned teachers, maybe you're already doing all these things. New teachers, check them off, make sure you've got all this going. It might seem a little bit obvious, but here we are. So good teaching means you know the big picture, which I kind of just talked about, the core. One thing this does is it allows you to cross your teaching over. So an example of that might be in when you're teaching ratios and proportional relationships, can you relate that back to an equation? Can you cross those two chapters over? With geometry, that relates back to algebra a ton. We get into the lessons in statistics that also represent a lot of algebra. So if you know the big picture, you can kill two birds with one stone. Teach two chapters at once. The next thing would be to assume that the students don't know how to do these things. This especially comes with new instruction. When we're showing them tape diagrams, we assume they know nothing. So one thing that I do as I'm getting ready to teach a tape diagram lesson is I'll have them work it out and then make sure that we're all doing things the same way. It's amazing to see how people in your students in your class will uh, change their work. They'll flip their equations around. They'll do things backwards. We have to give really, really explicit instruction on how to draw a tape diagram, what it represents, how to write an equation, how to show the work, how to do the order of operations. Very explicit instruction. The next thing that I'm big on, and I'll talk to you about this in the next slide, is just overuse the vocabulary. How many times have I said numerical expression this year? Every time I put something up, I say evaluate the numerical expression, or solve the equation, or generate an equivalent expression using the greatest common factor. I use that vocabulary constantly because that is really important um, to our sixth grade curriculum. Walk around. If you're not doing whiteboards, I highly suggest that you do. As you're walking around, you can see students' work, and that allows you. The next little tool here is to correct mistakes immediately. So if you've got a kid who's switching the order of their ratios, stop right away, help them, get them in good habits right away. And the last thing is always, always, always show students the correct answer. That kind of goes back to assuming that the students don't know how to do things. So if you've skipped over that, make sure you're always showing them the correct answer. When you correct exit tickets, they always have that correct answer. Group work, they always have the correct answer. When they've taken their tests, anything they've got wrong, we go back and we look at it, and they know how to find the correct answer. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is the last tool for student clarity is knowing vocabulary. It took me a couple years to realize that a lot of what we do in sixth grade is language, sixth grade math. It is a foreign language. And I've kind of just sat here and compiled a list of all the terms and vocabulary that is unique and brand new to our sixth graders. I'm sure I've missed a couple here, but just a huge list. So again, student clarity, if they don't understand these words, which I'm not going to go through all of them, but if they don't understand these words, they're lost. It is a complete foreign language to them. So it's a good idea to make sure that they know every single one of these things, and they can understand what they're supposed to be doing. So I hope those three things, teacher and student clarity with the core, elements of really good teaching, and understanding the vocabulary, those are three tools that you can use to help students and yourself be very, very clear and to check that principle off your list. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Katie Scheme, and I'm going to focus on our second principle, collective student efficacy. I know throughout my years of teaching, we have talked a lot about collective teacher efficacy. And as a team here, we have talked a lot about the importance of having collective student efficacy. So if we look at this visual, it kind of just breaks down this collective student efficacy. So efficacy is having that capacity to produce a desired result. Self-efficacy is one's own belief that they can reach that result. Collective efficacy then is that individual now is part of a group, and that group has a belief that through our combined abilities, we can attain that initial result that we're looking for. And collective student efficacy then is the perception that the students in a grade level have that their efforts as a whole grade level will help them to attain the desired outcome that we're looking for. So I'm going to focus on three different tools that can help us with that collective student efficacy. So the first tool is grade level goals. So a few years ago in 2019, we sat down as a team and we talked about coming up with a goal for our end of year testing for math. And we chose a goal that we had never reached before. In fact, it was about 6% higher than our best as that we had been for a grade level in math. And we set that as our goal, and we shared it with our students. We worked towards that throughout the year. We revisited kind of where we were going. And even as we got close to close to taking the end of year assessment, we still kind of had those doubts, like, are they ready? Are they prepared? Students were motivated to reach that goal, but we were just still had that kind of that little bit of fear of, are we going to make that goal? But that year, we actually scored 11% higher than that goal. So from that year on, we every year go through this process of setting a grade level goal for our end of year. So this is the process that we go through. At the beginning of the year, as a grade level, we pull all our students out to the Kiva, and we discuss with them kind of where they were at in fifth grade and kind of help them to see like what would be a reasonable goal that is going to push us, but is also going to be something that we can obtain. So, with our students, teachers all together as a whole big group, we set that goal. After we have that goal set, so it might be, right, whatever percent of students will be proficient on the end of your assessment. And it needs to be something that works for your grade level, something you get to decide and you feel good about. Once we set that goal, we display that goal in a central area. In our school, we have a grade level Kiva. So we have at the front of our grade level Kiva, we have that goal displayed. We revisit it often. Students see it every time that we meet together as a grade level. It's just kind of our focus that they see. Um, Throughout the year, we meet frequently to discuss our progress that we have made towards that goal. We talk about, are our scores on each of our units helping us to reach that goal? What are students doing at home? What are they doing at school so that we can be successful in meeting that goal? So we have found lots of success with it. It just gives us that, again, collective student efficacy. Everybody in the grade level, teachers, students, we are working towards one common goal at the end of the year. Along with that, we have tool number 2 is grade level incentives. So we know our students need some motivation to kind of keep them going, to help them when, some of our units get tough. We need that incentive that helps keep them motivated and helps keep them going. So with grade level incentives, at the beginning of each of our math units, we pull them again together out in the Kiva. We talk about an incentive that they would be interested in. A lot of times it's things like dodgeball or some extra recess or some free time, but we set that goal, we come up with that as incentive, and we refer back to that. So we say, what are we doing to reach that incentive? How are our exit tickets looking? How are our quizzes looking? Are we on track? And if we're not on track, we talk about what do we need to do? What are we doing? Are we watching the videos at home maybe if we're confused on a topic? Or are we doing some IXL practice? Like, what are we doing to help us reach that goal? One thing that we established with them are what are the requirements to earn this incentive? What is our percent that we're looking for that is passing? What is our percent of students that are required to get that passing percentage to earn that as incentive? The last thing that we found is really important is to hold them to those high expectations. There has been a few times that, whatever we set our goal at, we maybe there was one time we were 1% off and they did not earn the incentive. So we didn't just say, oh, they were close. We held them to that high expectation. We talked about, again, what could we have done better? What are some things that would have helped us if looking back now to reach that incentive? But it's been a fun thing as a grade level. They look forward to it. They ask us, what's our next incentive going to be? And I think it does just help to hold them to those higher expectations. The third tool that I'm going to talk about is grade level praise. So if we have that collective efficacy as teachers and also as students, we work on not only just like praising our students when they reach those, but praising all students. So one thing that has to happen is we have to know how all students are performing, whether this is talked about at our PLCs, whether it's talked about just in common conversation. We split our students up for interventions, and we want to know. I will go to another teacher and say, hey, how did so-and-so do on that retake quiz? Also, other teachers will come to me and say, hey, so-and-so did such a good job. They reached their quiz score by this much, or this is what they got on the test. They kind of been struggling. They've been putting forth so much work at home on IXL. Will you mention something to them? And when you can tell when it's not a student in your class and you point something out that they are doing really well at, it means so much to them because I think they're used to, hearing things from their teachers, but from someone that's not their teacher, pointing out what a great job they're doing, it just helps motivate them. So I think working together on that grade level praise, knowing that they're all our students, we're all working towards that same goal, and congratulating students, no matter if they're in our class or another class, when they have done something well is so important.
So I'll be talking about highly motivated students, which is principle number 3. A motivated student is a student who puts forth more effort, who shows more grit, which means is persistent and has more passion, and when faced with difficulties and failures, will continue to press forward. A motivated student also has more self-efficacy or belief in themselves that they can be successful. And lastly, a motivated student is more successful than a student who's not motivated. So it's clear that we want all our students to be motivated to learn. So I'm going to be talking about 3 tools. The first tool is the power of small wins. I always thought for a long time, how do you get students to be more motivated? And my idea was based on an old paradigm, which is, gosh, if they're not motivated, then they're not going to have action, which isn't going to lead to success. That was the old paradigm. The way I was taught what motivation was is you were motivated, which led to action, which led to success. And therefore, if you didn't have motivation, you didn't act and you didn't have success. So I thought for years and years as I first started teaching, man, how do I get my students to be successful? And then I read this book. It's The Motivation Myth by Jeff Hayden. And he says, as he studied high achievers, that they think of motivation completely different. And as you can see on the slide, the new paradigm is, and what he found successful people do is that they act, which leads to success, and then that equals motivation. So, in other words, motivation comes after the success, which is complete opposite to the old paradigm. At the top, there's a quote from his book. He says, success, even tiny incremental success, is the best motivational tool of all. And this makes sense because when we're trying to become successful at any new skill, or for example, trying to lose weight, we know that the motivation actually comes after we've been successful multiple times. And if we're not successful, and that's why diets tend to not work out, because the longer we go along, the less successful we become. We stop getting those small wins, therefore we lose that motivation. So tool number 1 isn't really an action tool. It's more of a paradigm shift. And it starts with that question that's on the bottom of the slide. How do I get my students to experience small wins? Instead of saying, how do I get my students to get motivated? Start thinking, how can I create small wins in my classroom? Which leads to tool number 2, which is design, instruction, and assessment for success. So I'm going to talk about 5 steps for what it takes to design, instruction, and assessment for success. The first step is to design, that means create, the assessments that your students can succeed on. And this is the part where the teacher has to look at the assessment, know what's on the assessment, and if necessary, tweak for students to be successful. So depending on your school, might depend on if you have to tweak some numbers or problems or other things to make that assessment more um, in line with how well your students can do. Number 2, teach so that students will be successful on the assessment. So your instruction should lead to the assessment. You want your students to be successful in that assessment, so your instruction should build up to that. Lots and lot, if you're doing math especially, lots and lots of whiteboard works. One of the big things I'm a fan of lately is the problem set, giving them 1 or 2 problems um, periodically during the lesson just to see where they are. And those problem sets can be very similar to some questions that are on maybe the exit ticket, for example. The other one is your group work. The work that they do collaboratively should also build towards their success on an assessment. Now, this gets to the part B here, where I strongly advise not to throw surprise questions on a quiz, questions that they haven't come across. Now, not doesn't mean that there's not a time and place, but the assessment is not the place for that. The best place for that is just a random time during a lesson. And you say, hey, we're going to do a challenge problem, um, where they don't feel that pressure that they have to be successful. Because if they don't succeed on that challenge question and it hurts them on their grade on that assessment, even if it's not graded, to them, they see that as a failure. And that's not going to build that motivation that we want. Number three, obviously, after that assessment, not all students are going to be successful. So we need some type of intervention and extension after the assessment. For us, we give a quiz A. They go to some class based on their score. And then step four, they get that opportunity to retake after the intervention. And step five kind of goes to what Katie talked about earlier, that grade wide praise where teachers are saying, hey, come back if you got this score after an intervention. And those students are so excited to come back and say, hey, I went from 2 out of 6 to 5 out of 6, so that they can see and feel that progress. And that success will build more and more motivation going with tool number one. And that's going to lead to more and more hard work. And all of a sudden, now your student is motivated. Um, Here is how we have designed our personal assessments in our math for our units. Um, Obviously, our number one goal is for students to be successful on the RISE test and to get 3 out of 4. When we want them to be successful there. So how do we prep them for that? It starts with, as you see on the bottom of the pyramid, lots and lots of exit tickets. Obviously, every lesson has an exit ticket. And along with every lesson, there's so many whiteboard problems. Um, the more success they get on those exit tickets, it builds confidence and builds that motivation. So when a quiz comes along, they can see that, hey, this is a bigger deal than an exit ticket. So hopefully they're going to take that quiz just as serious, if not more serious. And the more success they have on those quizzes, they get more confidence, more motivation. So when they take that unit test, which for our sixth grade option one unit, we only have 8 unit tests. So they really only have 8 different opportunities to prove that they can be successful. And that's how I view these tests. These are a big deal in my classroom. We focus on it. They know 2 weeks in advance when it's going to be. I want them to be prepared. I give them tools, videos, IXLs, extra work that they can do so that they are prepared. I send home reminders to the parents so they know in advance what they need to do. So when that test day comes, this isn't some spur of the moment like, oh, today's a test. They've been prepped, they're mentally prepared, and they know that this isn't just a test to prove that they can do the concept, but it's really a test that they can prove that they can learn. And when they're successful at those, then all of a sudden, when the RISE test comes along, they've had all these opportunities to be successful, and it just increases their chances of being successful. The last tool I want to talk about is framing failure. Obviously, we know that failure is just going to come. Not all students are going to succeed in every single assessment, nor do we really want them to, okay? Because we all know that life is not all a perfect success. So, how a teacher frames failure, when I say frames, that means how they talk about it, how they view it, is very, very important. So, the first step that you need to do is to help them realize failure is part of the process. Every student is going to fail. Everybody's going to fail at something in their life. They need to realize it's going to happen. Okay. This is a topic of conversation that could take place daily, if not at least weekly. They need to know that this is part of the process. One way I like to do it is to talk about successful people. For example, like Steve Jobs, Walt Disney, and Einstein. To make things quick, Steve Jobs, after he was fired from Apple, went on and created Pixar. And then Apple begged him to come back, and that's when he came back and he created the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and so many other great devices. Walt Disney, he lost his company early on before with that he had with his brother. On the train ride back, he draws Mickey Mouse and he creates Mickey Mouse, and Disney is born, and obviously we know the end story of that. And Einstein applies for a teaching job, fails. As he's at his regular job, he starts thinking about some ideas, and he comes up with what scientists might think is one of the greatest discoveries since Isaac Newton for the last 500 years, which is the general theory of relativity. So I tell my students, you want to fail like these people. Yes, you're going to fail, but what are you going to create from that? Number two, focus on their failures because of them. And I know that sounds rough, but if they feel like they're a victim, then they lose that motivation. But when they feel like they have control and they take ownership for it, that ownership motivates them to push on. You see this with athletes. They take that ownership and they realize I got to do better, and they prepare more, so when that next game comes they're even more successful. The unsuccessful athletes will blame other people or blame the refs or blame the coach or blame whatever. They didn't get enough playing time, and that doesn't lead to further success. So having them take that ownership it puts them in the driver's seat. And step number 3, you need to emphasize that failure comes because of one of 3 things. It's either A, lack of effort, B, poor attitude, or C, misunderstanding. And again, all those things go back to they are responsible for those. All right. So that's why we want to give them tools. So if they have a misunderstanding, there's always a video they can go back to that they can watch that night. I often ask students when they say something like, "Oh, I don't get this." I said, "Did you watch the video last night?" Just to put that ownership back on them to say, "Okay, what did you do?" So that you could even be more successful. Um, so to sum everything up that we've talked about, if we want to build student success, we need clarity, collective student efficacy, and our students need to be highly motivated. Hopefully these tools, these 9 tools we talked about, you can apply to your teaching and help your classroom as well as your grade level be more successful. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.